Food is not just food, guys. This conference is focused on food. I'd like to talk it into the real world. I'd like to broaden our understanding, our thought process with regard to food. I'd like to look at time and food. I'd like to look at place and food. I'd like to look at substance. What is it? What are we seeing? What are we not seeing in the food that we eat? I talk about we, which means you and I and our dogs, because let's face it, we are one and the same. And we're going to look at combinatorial questions as well. We have a...
Does it work now? Yeah.
This is good, because this is where I wanted to be. I'm very reassured. Last night we got together and we spoke and we laughed and we ate. And I met some wonderful people. And I think the future of raw food, the future of nutrition, the future of the world is in wonderful hands. I'm looking around at friendly and thoughtful and beautiful people who came together last night. And it's wonderful to be part of this journey, so I want to thank you. I want to thank Anna, because she is the focus of our world. She puts together this meeting, and we all come together and we enjoy each other's company and we develop ideas. Last night I was sitting with some of the guys and we had some amazing conversations about what we're going to do, how we're going to educate. Victor, it was great to see you. Daniel, it was great to see you. We all came together, we had a great time. So, I'm going to take it back to the basics. I'd like to invite you to my journey. I obsess about life, about food, always. My wife will attest. She's in the row there. And I said to Anna it was going to be really scientific and it was going to be a journey and it was going to be a thing. But actually, I'm just going to talk to you about cool stuff. Cool stuff I found since last year. Okay? So, here we go. What is food? Let's talk about what is food. The Oxford English Dictionary says that it's any nutritious substance that people or animals eat or drink in order to maintain life and growth and nourishment and provisions. I think that's a very narrow version of the world. But that's what they say. I think we can think much more broadly. One of my heroes, Dr. Robert Lustig, if you haven't found him, go on YouTube, check him out. He's thinking big and he's thinking very deeply about these things. He says, real foods are whole food with a minimum of ingredients and no food-like, yeah? He's talking about the NOVA classification, where we have 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 is ultra-processed. Ultra-processed food is substances derived from food. The Americans take 80% of their calorific value from ultra-processed food, and they ram it down the throats of everybody on the planet in the form of Hills and Royal Canin and Purina. And that's what we're taught to feed our dogs, and it is a travesty. He says that real food is mostly unprocessed, free of non-food substances and rich in nutrients and fiber. And he says, exquisitely, 75% of healthcare in America will be fixed if the world changed to real food. We are all about real food. And that's what we're going to be talking about right now. The good book says, I just thought I'd put the good book in. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything, which is very generous of him, methinks. But I really love Dr. Natasha Campbell, who says, food is energy. And we found that last night. Food is love. Food is vibration. This is what we're talking about. This is why we get so excited. This is her book. Lustig, I was listening to a podcast of his recently, and he said, food, what is it? And we've got to think about food science, nutrition, and metabolic health. There are actually three distinct things. Food science is what happens from the soil or the farm to your mouth. Yeah? That is food science. Nutrition is what happens from the mouth to the cell, the gut, the blood, the digestive enzymes. And cellular metabolism is what happens, and they are three distinct things. And I think we need to divide our thinking into those things. And as Conor Brady appropriately said yesterday, I think a lot of food science is shit. So nutrition is everything that goes into your mouth and is absorbed from your gut. And it doesn't mean necessarily that it promotes health. We put a lot of stuff in our body, either knowingly or unknowingly, that influences health. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. If you want some reading, I was outbooked by Eagle, your son, last night. He said he reads 3 books a week. Okay. I read a lot of books, and I really want to share with you a lot of those things. These are 3 books that we at Raw Pet Medics, we've looked into, and we found these incredibly useful. And I would suggest these are absolute musts to read. Complexity. Food is complex. This is a Boeing 787. There are 78 million separate parts within a Boeing 787. There are infinite supply chains. Yeah? That's complicated. What we are dealing with is complex. This is far more complex. Complex is where, when you start the process, you don't know where you're going to finish. Complicated is there's just a lot of steps, but you know where you're going to end up. You end up with a 787, okay, if you do the processes right. We, minute by minute, deal with complexity. It's almost unknowable. Is it understandable? Yes, it is, but we understand very little of what's happening, and therefore we need to use our vision to see what's happening within the real world. And we need to embrace the complexity. I think we do. Last night demonstrated that. This is a lovely book. I haven't read it yet, but by Skrinis, and he says, we May and Hills, Royal Canin, and Purina fall into the black hole of reductionist thinking. They think that if you put the right nutrients in a bag, you are done. And I'm going to suggest that that is not correct. Yesterday, Sarah's presentation demonstrated that there is the fine detail of what we put into our bodies is very, very important. He also says that respecting traditional dietary patterns, because they've been doing it for 3 million years, Ancient civilizations have been doing it. They know a thing or two because the people who did it wrong are not still on the planet. And we need to reduce technological processing, which is we need to get back to food. We need to forget about the kibble. Kibble, I don't know how they still maintain the truth of producing kibble. This is a recent Nature publication where it says that our understanding of how diets affect health is limited to 150 key nutrient components. 150 key nutrient components. But we know that there are 26,000 or more nutrients that are out there. So we're scratching the surface. Okay? And that's really exciting. To jump into an ocean is more exciting than jumping into a swimming pool, which is more exciting than jumping into a puddle. Royal Canin, Hills, Purina, they're swimming around in a tiny little puddle. They're not wrong, but they're very, very, very not right. Let's have a look at these influences on food. Bren, can you time me? Please. Thank you. Okay. We always look at what's in the bowl and the influence it has. But what other influences are there? Let's look at time. How does time change our physiology? And this is a question that Connor and I have been discussing the last few days. And it's called the serotonin diet. And it essentially means that you feed a high-protein meal, and then 1 or 2 hours later, you feed a high-carb meal. And it has a calming effect on the body. And if you look into the biochemistry, the thinking, it's not proven, there's a distinct lack of work in this area, which I'm really disappointed about. The thinking is that the large neutral amino acids are diverted such that tryptophan has a relative abundance. Okay? Let me give you an example of that. Because it's important, because when there's a relative abundance of tryptophan, it is selectively uptaken by the blood-brain barrier into the brain to make serotonin, which has a calming effect. This is my personal experience. I had a client once who had 2 dogs. She had an older German Shepherd who we treated for itch, and he was doing great. She then got a new young bitch, and this dog was hyperactive. And so she said, what can I do? I said, let's try. This is a long time ago. I don't use the serotonin diet very much anymore. She said, what can we do? So I said, let's try the serotonin diet. So she did the protein 2 hours and carbohydrate diet for both dogs because it was easier to feed both dogs the same way. And she found that the hyperactive dog improved beautifully. But, unbeknownst to her, the older dog, who was pretty laid back anyway, became a zombie because he was on the same diet, okay? So I think there is something there. There is a signal of something happening, and I think that the research needs to catch up. Let me give an example of relative change. Okay, so we are the Raw Pet Medics. And you see that these other 2 geezers are really quite tall. And so the example is that if you remove those other 2 guys, I become relatively tall. Okay? And so if there was a tall competition, I would win it, but not with them around. Obviously, the average IQ in our group would rise dramatically as well. But we're not going to talk about that. This is how tryptophan does it. Tryptophan is not very tall, but when the competition has gone, we get selective uptake, which is a very clever mechanism. And you can do it by inducing insulin. And that's how the serotonin diet works. There is some science to suggest that this is the way that things work. This is a study. They took groups of dogs, 3 groups of dogs. They fed puffed rice, mince, and olive oil, like a standard, vaguely nutritious diet. They then tried M2, which was the puffed rice and olive oil, and then they took a regular dry diet. And they found that the puffed rice diet did lead to enhanced tryptophan. So there is some science to suggest that this may be the case. But there's a deafening silence since these ideas were first floated, maybe 15 years ago. This is a study. It's not a very good study. It wasn't blinded, but it's well worth looking at. And what they found was when they did the serotonin diet, the 2-hour diet, they found that anxiety and agitation reduced. Yeah, the orange versus the dark orange lines. They found that calm and relaxed states increased, the bluey color versus the green color. And so I think there is a signal here. This is a word that we've come across since COVID. There is a signal, and I don't think we should ignore it. I think it's worth some study. What about meal timing? This is really an interesting thing. There's Robin, I know, doesn't eat breakfast because he is trying to narrow his nutrition window. And I first came across this with this book by Terence Keeley. It's called Breakfast is a Dangerous Meal, which is a brilliant title because it's so gripping. And he suggested that eating later in the day is a good idea. Things have moved on since then, but there's a recent study, a 2019 study here, where they took 3 groups of 12 guys. This was in Bath, actually, where we're from. And one group had breakfast and then rest. The second group had breakfast and then exercise. The third group had exercise, then breakfast. And Steve, you'll be really happy about this. This is what we were talking about this morning. And he found that what he found was that if you have exercise before you eat first thing in the morning, and you don't eat as soon as you get out of bed, when your cortisol is rising and you're in a fatty acid dependent fasting state, all of which influence your the glucose tolerance and your insulin levels, he found that that group could eat as much as they like for the rest of the day, and still they lost 400 calories every day. How cool. Just thinking about timing. So it's not just what goes in the bowl. It's how we work within the circadian rhythm. Really interesting. Like I say, these are things that are going through my mind very, very frequently. How many times a day? Yeah, vets among us will know that we're often asked, how many times a day should we be feeding our dogs? I think that we should feed once a day is ideal. I say to my clients that fasting is to the pancreas. Matt, we were talking about the pancreas yesterday. Fasting is to the pancreas what sleeping is to the brain. It's very important. So it's not what you feed, when you feed, but it's also what kind of spacing you can do. Not all dogs can do it, but ideally we should, I think, be feeding once a day in order to avoid cognitive dysfunction, gastrointestinal, dental, orthopedic, kidney, and liver and pancreatic problems. Once a day feeding is the ideal. You can't always do it, but that is the way to go. Kaberlin, after this study, bizarrely said, don't change how you're feeding. But I would say, if you can, move to once a day feeding. I think that's really important. Connor and Brendan and I do a talk every Tuesday night, UK time, 7 p.m. It's called Raw Pet Medics. And we just talk about this stuff. We talk about serious subjects, but we don't take ourselves very seriously. Please come along, join. It's free. you're very welcome to come along. So we're feeding once a day, but when is it best to feed once a day? And from my reading, it suggests from Kearley and Betts, it suggests feeding before bed is not a great idea. This paper here, it's from a Spanish group where the Spaniards tend to eat at kind of 9, 10 p.m. at night, which is a bad idea. Cortisol is reducing, melatonin is increasing, and that's a very obesogenic time of day to eat. So I suggest feeding before bed, not a great idea. Feeding first thing in the morning, as soon as you get out of bed, not a great idea. If you think of the caveman or woman, they would not have eaten first thing. They would have gone out, they would have had to go and get a drink from the local river. It may have been 2 kilometers away. They would have had to go and find food. So the idea of feeding, as soon as you get up, God forbid you have Kellogg's cornflakes, is not a great idea. So first thing is not a great idea. So I think that the guidance should be sometime. It's not super early, not super late. It's got to be within that time. And if you can reduce it to a short eating window, this is the whole keto thing, the whole feeding window aspect is a very good idea, because then your body can do all the parasympathetic work of digestion in a short period and then switch off. And that, I think, is perhaps a good idea. So I can't tell you when to feed, but I would suggest that feeding in a short period is probably a good idea. What about the rate of eating? This is some really interesting stuff. Brendan and I have read a wonderful book recently called Ultra Processed People by Chris Van Tulloken. I would suggest it's a great book to get into. And there are some interesting studies looking at the rate. Okay, so we looked at the time of day. Now, what about just the rate of eating with people? This is not dog work, but I'm sure it plays into it, in that kibble you can eat in 30 seconds. Real food can take you longer, and if you're eating meat off a bone, it substantially takes you longer. And what they found was that eating quickly is positively associated with excess body weight. Further studies are warranted to determine interventions. If you eat quickly, then it's more obesogenic. The second study there, we can't quite see it, but that there is a correlation between ultra-processed food consumption and obesity, accounting for the differences in energy rate. You can eat McDonald's in 90 seconds, and that, regardless of what you're eating, is not good. So rate of eating is really, really important. This is an interesting study. They got 2 groups of people, and they said, here's a really thick milkshake, here's a really thin milkshake. And when they gave them the thin milkshake, their energy consumption was 47% increased. Same nutrition, different timing. So, rate of eating is very important. Okay, that's time. Let's look at place. How are we doing for time? Okay. Let's look at place. Where you eat makes a difference. Where you eat does make a difference. If you eat here, you and your dog are going to be more healthy. Why is that? I won't keep you guessing. It's because it's above 4,500 meters. And in those zones, so where you eat, if you live in Colorado, if you live in the uplands of Colorado, your chances of getting cardiovascular, cerebrospinal problems is reduced, because you are in a zone with reduced oxygen capacity, And so you have a reduced risk of metabolic diseases, diabetes, coronary artery disease, hypercholesterolemia, and obesity. If you want to look into this, this is a wonderful book, What Your Food Ate by Montgomery. And I would suggest this is a really a wonderful way to look into. So it's not, you know, your grandmother would say, you are what you eat. Montgomery takes it one stage further and he says, you are what your food ate. Let's look into that a little bit further. The reason that living at high altitude, eating at high altitude is beneficial is because of mitochondrial biogenesis. And there are studies which suggest that low oxygen tension actually enhances your metabolic profile because your mitochondria are happier. They are in a generative place. Okay, place. These studies stunned me. If you're a junkie and you're taking heroin and you take it at home and you take the same stuff away from home in a non-familiar situation, that stuff, the same stuff, is more toxic. So when you are in a foreign environment, you are more susceptible to toxic elements. This blew my mind, yeah? Because we don't think about, where do you feed the dog? Okay. It's an interesting idea, and I offer it as an interesting idea. What you're going to do with it, I don't know. But if you don't think it, you can't work it. So I'm presenting it to you as a fascinating idea. So another book. This is Provenza, Nourishment. Wonderful book to read if you haven't read it. And he suggested that if you move cattle from your farm to unfamiliar grazing, and they come across the same toxic plants, they are more susceptible, perhaps, to those unfamiliar toxic plants than when they're at home. Unbelievable. It's a great thought experiment, methinks. Okay, so we've talked about food. We've talked about time. Now let's look at substance. Let's look at actually what's going into our bodies, what's going into the dogs that we feed. This is something, again, on Raw Pet Medics we've been talking about, where the state, and Sarah in her wonderful presentation, Sarah, where are you? Still in bed. Oh, you're there. Great presentation. The form of the nutrient is very important. And this was the first paper we came across in Raw Pet Medics, given to us by a colleague. And it suggested that if you add phosphorus in an inorganic, in a salt, in an artificial form, you get a greater blood spike than if you give it in a more natural form, which is really interesting. And then Dobernecker came along and did the same work with dogs, and I'm just going to take you through this. No talk is complete without a few graphs. So this is the control, and this is a high-protein chicken meal here. They didn't even feed real food, and they still had the same effect. But this is the closest thing they got to real food, and you see that the phosphorus, the jump in phosphorus after eating a meal is equilibrated, whereas when you feed Purina and Royal Canin salts, like these, you get a much greater jump. These are the salts, This is the phosphorus. There's an impact, but it's minor in comparison. Karen's going to talk to you next, and she's going to talk about Newton. And we had a beautiful journey with him, and we used this kind of data to modify his diet. And he did great for a very long time. Let's talk about trans fats. I spoke very briefly with Susan yesterday with regard to trans fats. And this is the subject that shall not be mentioned. Trans fats, these are fats that have been overoxidized or hydrogenated, which twists. I'd love to talk to you about this. Brendan is equally geeky on this stuff. Molecules appear, but they can be a mirror image of each other, yeah? So they're exactly the same composition, but if it's a mirror image, the body can recognize the cis, the regular version, but cannot recognize this transformed, the trans version of the molecule. And we've known for a long time in humans that trans fats are really bad for you. And let's just look into that for 1 second. So, in the EU, you're only allowed 2 grams per 100 grams of fat, and fat is usually a small-ish component of the diet. You're only allowed 2 grams per 100. In the USA, because these dastardly corporations have been in cahoots with the food advisory bodies, they've got it down to, you can have, as a manufacturer, if you have less than 0.5 grams of trans fats per serving, you can say there's negligible, 0 trans fats in that meal. So that means that if you eat a box of Twinkies, you're taking on a vast amount of these trans fats. Okay? It's this I give you as an example, and I can give you 1,000 examples of corporate malfeasance, corporate manipulation of the food structure. If you eat ultra-processed food, they are doing you. Eat real food. Feed your dog real food. As far as you can, feed regenerative and organic. Organic is the lowest on the totem pole. If you can feed a product from regenerative product sources, then so much the better. Our friends at Hills are using canola, soybean, sunflower. We know that. They don't mention trans fats, but they will extrude those products, these wonderful, convenient products. They will extrude them up to about 150 degrees C, but they'll dry them up to 200 degrees C. And this food, this influence on the fats within the food can be very substantial, but nobody's talking about it, yeah? Again, talking to Susan, trans fats is not in the conversation. AFCO, this is from an AFCO presentation. They can measure trans fats. So they must be there. They wouldn't measure them if they weren't there, yeah, logically. But when you look online, there is nothing. And I think that we need to bring this to the conversation, yeah? They've got 1 or 2 sticks to beat us with. But I think this is a stick with which we can beat the kibble manufacturers. I'd love to hear what FEDIAF has to say when Michael comes in. Okay, this is my favorite topic, and I could give you a 2-day seminar on soil, fungi, food, and the positive nutritional benefit. I'm not going to bore you with that, but this is some. These are some of thousands of analyses demonstrating that when you have healthy soil with great microbial and fungal health within them, you will produce better food. You've got higher antioxidants, you've got increased nutrients within the food, you've got anti-cancer elements within the food if the soil is healthy. Most of what we eat is unhealthy. Natasha Campbell-McBride says that everything in the supermarket is toxic. Yeah? Go to your local farmer who is regenerating soil, and that's where you need to buy your food from. Nobody does it. We don't even do it. But ideally speaking, it's a concept you need to really play with. This is a book that expounds these thoughts very, very graphically and sympathetically. We're jumping ahead there. Nitrogen fertilizer, yeah, it's essential. Yeah, if you just want to create yield, nitrogen fertilizer is a great thing. But in the process, you're degrading soil. To create regenerative farming methods using large ruminants to feed the soil and grow quality soil is more important. Nitrogen fertilizer, yes, it gives you yield, but it reduces the health of the product that comes across it. That's either grains that go into your food, or it goes into grass, which feeds the ruminant, which goes into your food. And there is overuse, just even use of the nitrogen fertilizers. We get depletion of minerals. We get enhancement of toxic elements, for example, aluminium. And we get retardation of growth, and we get harms to soil, etc. It's an enormous problem that we see with food. Soft UPF food, this doesn't really apply to dogs, but I thought I'd just share it anyway. This is a wonderful, amazing guy. He had some strange ideas, but his basic concept was that the modern, and we're talking 1930s, he was saying, he was Weston A. Price. He was a dentist at the beginning of the last century, and he was saying, why am I seeing so many bad mouths? And so he did something about it. He went and traveled across the world, and he looked at native peoples. He called them primitive, but actually I think they are head and shoulders above us in so many ways. And he compared what he was seeing in his surgery, just appalling dentition, facial structure, because of the nutrition, the refined diets that the Americans even then were eating. This is pre-McDonald's. Even then, he was seeing terrible dental problems. But when he went across the world, surprise, surprise, when people were eating their indigenous foods, they had great bone structure. They had wonderful dentition. And this was a surprise to him, and he shared it. I even found a reference in Finland. Skull structure recently, because of improved nutrients, has increased. Skull size has increased, but jaw size has reduced by 6%. Even in Finland, and I think Finland, they eat pretty well. But the influence of refining food, as soon as you start refining food, then you degrade food. Okay, triage effect is something that came across recently. And basically it says that if you're not deficient in a nutrient, But maybe if it's just a little scarce, what happens? And logically, what happens is that your body prioritizes. If you've only got a whisper of petrol in your car, you're not going to go to the fun fair in the car. You're going to go to the supermarket. And that's what the body does when you're low but not deficient, yeah, i.e. you've run out of gas. The body says, we're going to prioritize where we put these nutrients, and therefore it puts them into mobility and reproduction. And it doesn't put them into cellular cleanup and maintenance, which means, because we're living so long these days, that the problems with cardiovascular disease, with cancer, are going to increase if we're not feeding the right nutrients. Yeah, again, Sarah was talking about the raw food diet and optimizing intake. Just because you're not deficient does not mean that you're not running on empty. Interesting. This is especially, these are the minerals that we've seen so far: calcium, selenium, zinc, iron, copper. In terms of vitamins, it's the B's and D. And omega-3s. When you're running on empty with omega-3s, things happen. So I think for me, it's justified in always supplementing with omega-3s. That's a big conversation. But last thought is, how many common amino acids do you know about? Yeah, you're taught this, yeah, by your Jojo, your feeding advisor, yeah? 20 common amino acids, yeah? La, la, la. I came across this recently, ergothioneine. I'd never heard of it. It's an amino acid which is profuse in the beautiful regenerative soils, and it is, when you have the microbes and the fungi in the soil, it is seen in much higher levels, and it prevents you from cellular injury, cardiovascular, neurodegenerative disease. And this is just a call to read broadly, think broadly, talk broadly, because there's more out there than we know about. This is really interesting. I'm pleased to say that in Finland, France, Ireland, and Italy, where they eat more mushrooms, for example, there's more ergothioneine in the nutrition, and they have these protective effects, which is quite interesting. Okay, let's have a look at combination effects. I've got to thank Matt for this. So, you think you understand mineral and vitamin nutrition? I did until I spoke to Matt, okay? It's complex. It's not complicated. Complicated, you could work out. Give it into a big computer, you'll get the answer. This is complex. We need to look at the interplay between these things, and we are novices in this field. I'm going to talk to you about Clara's kids. This is really fascinating. She did a pilot study in 1928, on 3 children, where she gave them free access to food. Yeah? You couldn't get away with this these days, okay? Ooh. Okay. She gave the children access to a variety of foods, and some of them came in with rickets. Some of them came in with nutritional disease. Again, you couldn't do it these days. And she just let these just weaned children have free access to food. And these are the results. These are the foods that she gave. And what she found that the children didn't, my children would for the first day or two, yeah? But what she found is with these children, it's not a great study. There are problems with the study, but most importantly, and Clara was very compassionate with her children, most importantly, they were not encouraged. The child who came in with rickets was not encouraged to eat cod liver oil. He just chose it off his own bat. And he healed himself of that. And what they found was that at the end of the study, and the study concluded in 1939, that these children were actually healthier than their peers. And they had been eating a self-selected diet. And importantly, and this is why I bang on about variety so much, is that each child chose a different diet, and each child chose a different diet which varied. So variety really is key to this whole thing. A similar effect happened. This is Doc Holliday, and he, a neighboring farm, had problems with their cattle. They didn't know what was happening, and so they looked at the nutrition, and the cattle were eating loads and loads and loads of minerals, and yet this problem was still happening. So the neighbor said, right, I'll do a cafe style. Here's your magnesium, here's your zinc, here's your phosphorus, here's your whatever it might be. And he was putting that out. He was walking across the field with a bag of one nutrient on his back. And these normally docile dairy animals mugged him to get to the bag of feed. In that bag was, this is the cafe style, in that bag was zinc. It was a supplement of zinc. And the cattle, they weren't mineral deficient, they were zinc deficient. And they actively chased the mineral that they were looking for. Okay, that's a little wander around my brain for 45 minutes. What is my conclusion? You're not going to like this. My conclusion is that if you don't have 100 conflicting food, nutrition paradigms running around in your head, and talking to people last night, this is very true. We had broad discussions. We asked more questions than we gave answers. If you don't have 100 paradigms running around in your head at any one time, you ain't a nutritionist. You're a dogmatist. Don't be a dogmatist, and enjoy your journey. We're doing, as I say, I'm just laboring this, and these guys are going to be sick of me for it. Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. UK time, we discuss all this stuff, and we laugh a lot. And it's a podcast, and it's a Facebook Live. And you're really welcome to join us with that. I'm just looking at the boys to make sure I haven't missed anything. If you'd like to get in touch with me, this is when we were just on our way to, this is at Heathrow, on our way to Sri Lanka, so I was feeling fairly chilled. If you'd like to get in touch with me, please do. If you want to discuss these things, if you want to talk about books, if you want some good reading, I want to share those things with you. So if I do Instagram, I hate Instagram, I hate Facebook, but they are part of the modern diet. And so I'd like to feed people with good mental nutrition. Please get in touch, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nick, for your talk. We have time for one or two questions while we set up the next lecture. So if I could just ask the next speaker to please make their way up onto the stage. And if we have some questions, I'm going to throw this out. So, okay, we have one question.
You didn't say it actually, but in one of your slides you said that when the children were choosing, it said that when they were having an inflammation, they chose raw meat.
I know. Isn't that wonderful?
That is
And
wonderful.
He noted the disease, can't remember it.
Yeah, I think it was like infection, maybe infection actually.
It was
not inflammation.
an abstruse disease.
Yeah. I would very much like to get hold of that article. So could you send that to me?
I'm going to send the entire talk to Robin. So if you want some references, they're all on the talk. So yeah.
And I actually, personally, I use a lot of choose yourself for dogs. I've never tried it on my children, but now they're maybe a bit too old. Maybe I'll have to go on
Clara
my
did it
grandchildren.
post-weaning. So she had a head start, I think.
Yeah, I think that was cool.
Okay.
You have to throw it.
I'm pleasantly surprised to see so many people here. I thought there was going to be 2 after the party last night.
I have a question about the serotonin diet.
Yeah.
Well, I think we all know that carbohydrates are not good for dogs. How come it had the calming effect to the dogs?
Yeah.
What's your opinion?
I think that's a great question. All you need is an insulin hit. All you need is to raise insulin a couple of hours after in order to pack away the tryptophan. No, to pack away the large molecules to leave tryptophan for blood-brain barrier absorption. And you can do that any way you like. Back in the day, it was pasta or rice. If it was me now, I would be using greens and If it was me now, I'd be